Well, we'll start and we'll adjourn if and when. Order. Minister to move the adjournment.
Move for me.
The question is that the sitting be now adjourned. Gisela Stuart.
Thank you, Mr. Crosby. The title of this debate is Sustainable Local Authority Funding. It's my contention that it is neither sustainable, it is not local, and it certainly does not confer any authority. I will, with permission, focus on our cities, not because I want to set up an argument between urban and rural areas, but because what is bad for our cities is also bad for our urban areas. And if our cities don't do well, then the rural areas will suffer. Our cities are not a reflection of the national economy. It is my contention that our cities are the national economy. And if our cities don't do well, then the country won't do well. And if we don't generate growth, then the rest of the country will suffer. And you certainly don't generate growth by throttling your engine. Our cities are competing not with the rural areas, they're competing with other international cities. And their complex system, even though Whitehall merely treats them as if they were complicated. Jet engines are complicated. There are systems which you can predict, and you can predict the outcome. Cities are complex. You can't predict the outcome. The players aren't always rational. But above all, there are systems which can come up with their own ideas and their own solutions to problems if only they're given the permission to do so. England is the most centralised country in the world. And this holds back our cities, its time is growth and its time is productivity. But it also produces poor value for our public services. Our cities were once great, and certainly if you're a Birmingham MP, you're aware of that. But literally since the 19th century, there's been a continued reduction of their power and a shift towards the centre. The single most radical power shifts probably came in the 1980s, with rate capping and financial penalties. When they were introduced, and then in 1986, the Greater London Council and the 6 metropolitan-wide counties in England, and England's largest cities, were abolished. Things are different on the continent, and it is worth looking at that. Every city outside the capital in Germany has GDP per capita above the national average. They're dragging the national average up. In Italy, it's 6 out of 8. In France, all are at or above the national average. We are the only country in Western Europe where, apart from Bristol, the top 8 cities are below the national average, and therefore the cities are dragging down the nation's economic performance. And by the way, that's not me who's saying this.
There's a division in the comments, so the committee will stand adjourned for 15 minutes, but the time will be added on at the end of the debate. Gisela Stuart.
Thank you, Mr. Crosby. The comparisons with England and France, Italy and Germany weren't my words. They were the words of the member for Tunbridge Wells, the Right Honourable Greg Clark, the Minister for Cities. The previously Labour government did embrace devolution. We devolved power to Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and we restored London's citywide government in the year 2000, led by a directly elected executive mayor. However, England outside the capital remains unfinished business. It is a shame that the government imposed police commissioners, but presented us with a rather botched referendum on directly elected mayors in some of our cities. And I really do regret that our major cities don't have directly elected mayors, because those leaders need the support of the whole electorate and not just a small cabal of their own councillors. Because they need authority. Their names, to be quite frank, the leaders of the core cities, their names ought to be rolling off the tongues the way we can name cabinet ministers, but they don't. Running a city the size of Birmingham is probably a by far more difficult task than many a cabinet post. And yet we don't give them the political authority those leaders ought to have. And maybe I could suggest to the Minister a small way of remedying this, and given the noble Lord Whitby of Harborne set as a precedent, that retiring council leaders should actually join the House of Lords to have some representation of local government. And I'm not entirely sure whether the current mayor of London would be terribly keen to be offered a place in the House of Lords after he finishes his term, but it's worth a try. It's worth a try. The second contention is that it is actually not local. And again, let me quote from the Minister for Cities. He says, "At the root of the problem is a lack of local control over the city's own affairs and spending." And when he talked about taking up his post, he said there were two things which he had to do. First was to persuade the Cabinet to accept the principle to have licensed exceptions to national policy, so that cities can actually come up with their own way of dealing with things. And if I remember rightly, questions to the Deputy Prime Minister today, a number of members raised again that question, that when you deviate from national strategy, the presumption should be that you're allowed to, rather than having to prove that you shouldn't.
Would my friend...
Certainly.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and would like to congratulate her on securing this debate and the excellent point she is making. In response to my recent debate on local government finance holdbacks, the Minister claimed to be freeing local authorities to stand on their own 2 feet. Would my honourable friend agree with me that it is the height of hypocrisy to claim to be freeing up our great cities when actually they are taking key powers into Whitehall, such as inward investing, housing, skills, economic development and European funding?
Indeed, and I shall make the case by showing something in the case of Birmingham, but presumably a true liberal also regards the freedom to fail as a freedom, and probably that is one of the freedoms our cities have been given. The second thing the Minister for Cities said, the second thing is to liberate from the central government barons funding that can be better spent locally. I can't improve on his observation. The third, and that's something which I think quite a number of colleagues here will agree with in their different ways, is the current funding structures is not sustainable. If there was some great vision of how our cities can succeed, then we could engage with that. But I think what is happening at the moment is that, well, let me quote Sir Albert Bohr, the leader of Birmingham City Council, who said, "Politicians in Westminster are systematically dismantling services that maintain the very fabric of culture and community here." Now, Birmingham's total budget is, in 2013-14, was £3.4 billion. This covers a whole number of things a council has to do, a council might do. The money comes from a whole variety of things, which is virtually impossible to explain to any of our voters if you were to talk about the structure. And I'm also wary of quoting figures, and I do so for two reasons. One is, we throw things like millions and billions around as if it was just the small change of a letter. I always find it very useful to remind yourself that 1 million seconds is 11.5 days. 1 billion seconds is 31.7 years. It is a massive difference in those kind of figures. And second reason is that whenever I look at it, and I think I've got a handle on the cuts, things change. I turned on the television set yesterday and found the Chancellor in the West Midlands announcing another 25 billion cuts, and I wasn't entirely sure where they're going to come from. But the latest figure for Birmingham, which is the one we're working on, is that we need to find savings totalling just under 840 million between 2010 and 2018. Including 120 million of cuts in the 2014-15 financial year. Certainly.
A very powerful point indeed, a very powerful case for maintaining local government funding across the nation, not just in the cities but everywhere else. But can I just ask one question? Would you prefer those cuts, which are necessary because of the financial situation that the government found itself in 3 years ago, would you prefer those cuts come by finding savings in local government, or would you prefer those cuts to come in national government, and if in the latter, in what area?
Gisela Stuart.
I think it's a very fair point, but as I will come on later, I think by the end of this Parliament, local government will have taken 33% of the cuts, whereas Whitehall has taken 12% of the cuts. And I will also suggest some things which are not robbing Peter to pay Paul, but actually give greater liberty in a managed way for our cities to survive. Because what we've got at the moment is those areas in the greatest needs are cut most. So it may sound sort of slightly boring here, but let's just look at figures cost per dwelling. In Birmingham, in 2014-15, using the government's preferred measure of spending power, we will lose £145.59 per dwelling. That's 5.3%. The national average is £71.58. And in Levy, Wokingham, and Wokingham is not very popular in my constituency, not just as a comparison, but one of my local councillors comes from Wokingham, and he takes slight umbrage that we keep quoting it. But Wokingham gets an increase of funding of £5.20, which is 0.3%. And in 2015-16, it will be even worse, because Birmingham will lose 5.6%, and Wokingham will increase by 3%. There's a whole list of shires and counties which are also going to increase. But what is happening is at every turn the combination of grant reduction and budget pressures just widens to the point, and let's be clear, to the point where it is no longer a question of cutting services. It will mean that some services simply will not be delivered.
For giving way, and she's setting out a really important case. But does she agree with me that it isn't just the impact of cuts to local authorities' spending, but also the cumulative impact of that taken along with welfare reforms, which tend to hit our cities, and particularly our most deprived cities, the hardest, and having a really detrimental impact on local economies?
Gisela Stuart.
Absolutely, and I will have a couple of very specific questions to the Minister that we hope will outline of minimising those even further cuts than the ones we have. The Minister, in answer to a question on the 18th of December, suggested that Birmingham should be more efficient with its back office and look at how to use its reserves to invest for the future. I had a chat with Birmingham City Council about just how much they spend on their back office. They have already made some cuts. They will go on making some of the largest single cuts in 2014-15. However, even if Birmingham were to entirely remove its back office services, it could not meet the cuts for 2014-15, let alone those for 15-16. Which leads me to a rather unusual position for me, and is that I'm at one with the noble Lord Heseltine, who in April 2013, when he addressed the 200th anniversary dinner of the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce, called for no less than a peasants' revolt. And I think that that is what is needed. And his definition of the peasants' revolt was that a reallocation of power back to the people who created the wealth in this country in the first place. And for that, we require three elements. First is more control over the money received from central government, and this is an important point, at a timescale which actually allows for proper planning. Because at the moment, the cuts are being imposed and introduced at such a fast pace that actually none of the local authorities, be they cities or rural areas, have the time to properly reflect how to best reorganise them. And in some areas, we even find that we have confusion as to what statutory duties are, because some statutory functions have been farmed out, and councils have even lost that even when they cancel the contract, they're actually in breach of their statutory duties. The second one is greater freedom over the money raised locally, and the third, the means to financially benefit from the investments and savings made. However, I don't think that this is sufficient. Relying on council tax for raising revenue will only help the affluent areas. The capping by a referendum and the utterly out-of-date banding systems mean that for authorities who rely heavily on central government grants, it just makes things worse. So what we need is a more radical idea. We could raise a local tax or look at a system of apportionment of local raised VAT to replace the grant. But what I'm simply looking for at this stage from the Minister is an acknowledgement that if he pursues on the current trajectory, some of our cities will go to the wall. And this is not being dramatic. I think this is borne out if you look at the figures. I have a number of very specific questions. One is about the Better Care Fund. Am I right in assuming that NHS transfers across the clinical commissioning groups, which start in 2015-16, whilst not overtly redistributing funds from rural to urban, will end up doing so given the age profile of rural areas? And that Better Care Fund is not new money, it is a kind of redistribution. So if a city like Birmingham, where almost 46% of the population is under the age of 30, compared with 36.8% for England, then if we're focusing on the elder population, we will disproportionately be hit. Similarly, in contrast, Birmingham's over 65 is 12.9% compared with 16.9% in England. The second question is about education. Education funding was not part of the local government finance settlement, as it's mainly funded through the ring-fence dedicated schools grant. But the current formula is historic, and there's a consultation going on. When can we expect the result? Will it include a minimum funding guarantee which will protect losses at a per-pupil level? Because 2015 is going to be a crunch year for our cities and local authorities. And unless they have some indication of how not just the known grants, but the ones which underpin it play out, they will not be able to plan. And that takes me to the final observation. The Local Government Association already says that some councils are not viable. How many councils does the Minister think are in that category? And does he agree with the work done by the Mayor of London, which actually suggests that we should hand tax-raising powers to England's largest cities? Will he give the English cities control of the revenues from all property taxes, such as stamp duty, council tax and land tax, and business rates? Because one thing is for sure, that the cities will manage those funds differently, and I would contend better. And will he lift the cap on local government capital borrowing? I'm not for one moment saying that local authorities don't read renewing, that some of the funding structures don't need to be looked at. But it needs to be done in a planned way, in a sustainable way, and one which actually allows the authorities to respond in a positive way. And finally, I invite the Minister to come to Birmingham, because 2014 actually marks the 100th anniversary of the death of Joe Chamberlain, the man who introduced the concept of good governance into our cities. And I hope that if we do sit down and talk together and look at some of the structures, I hope we can come up with a way of maintaining the strength of our cities and not mark Joe Chamberlain's 100th anniversary of his death by killing our cities by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.